In the previous videos, we've seen how we can push on or pop off sound mix modifiers to change the audio mix in a game through blueprints. But sometimes there'll be circumstances where it would be great to automate this process. For example, if you want a ducking mix to happen whenever dialogue plays. Luckily, this is where passive sound mix modifiers come in. If we open our Epic Audio hierarchy, you might have noticed that the dialogue sound class looks slightly different to the others in that it's highlighted in green. This is because this sound class has a passive sound mix modifier attached to it. Passive sound mix modifiers allow the automated application of mix states. Whenever a sound from this sound class is played, this passive sound mix modifier will be applied. Looking at this sound mix duck for dialogue, we can see that its duration is -1, so ordinarily that would hold on indefinitely until the sound mix was popped off. But when it's acting within a sound class as a passive sound mix modifier, these mixes will actually hold on until the sound itself stops. This makes it really useful since we can have sounds of different lengths and have the mix automatically apply when they're playing. So this duck for dialogue, it brings down the music sound class to 0.2 and the sound effects sound class to 0.2, and it maintains dialogue at 1. So let's have a look at an instance where you might use this. You might remember at the entrance to the forest here, you've got a wood fairy that you engage in conversation. Now it's quite a quiet environment here, so you can clearly hear the wood fairy dialogue.
I'm a wood fairy, and these are my magical woods. Bring me a flower, and I might guide you.
Okay, so that's no problem. We can hear that dialogue clearly, which is really important since dialogue often carries vital gameplay information. I'm going to just create a copy of that, and then I'm going to pilot it across to a different position in the level. So say we were having a similar conversation, but this time it was happening over here by the waterfall. You can hear that it's a bit more problematic. So we can't hear that dialogue at all. Let's find this sound wave that plays that first line here. And we can, well, it's actually a sound cue. And you can see it's set to the default sound class master. So we're going to change that to set to the dialogue sound class. So that sound plays, it belongs to the dialogue sound class. The dialogue sound class has got a passive sound mix modifier called duck for dialogue. So when the sound plays, it's going to automatically assign that mix. So we'll play here, and we'll turn on stat sound mixes so we can see what's going on. So at the moment we've got the master mix, and I'm going to talk to the wood fairy.
Hello, traveller. I'm a wood fairy, and these are my magical woods. Bring me a flower, and I might guide you.
So you could hear there that the sounds of the waterfall were ducked because the waterfall belongs to one of the sound effects children categories, and we could hear the dialogue a bit more clearly. So while we're here, let's just bulk edit the rest of the dialogue sound cues. In fact, let's do the whole lot. So we'll filter by sound cue. We'll select all, right click, and bulk edit via property matrix. And here is our sound class. So we'll find the dialogue sound class here and apply it to all of those objects. Now earlier I said that the sound mix would automatically be applied whenever a sound belonging to this class plays. It's not quite the whole story. If we take a look at the dialogue sound class here again in the hierarchy, you can see that you've got this min volume threshold and max volume threshold. So a sound will only call this sound mix if it falls within the min and max thresholds. So with the ducking dialogue system, I could say that I only want this mix to actually apply if the dialogue is going to be difficult to hear. So let's say if it's up to 0.8, then we're going to assume that we can hear it quite clearly. But if the volume of the dialogue is any lower than that, that's when it should instigate the sound mix. So let's take our wood fairy and just move it across a little bit here. I just need to edit the parent blueprint of that so that I can use my E key at any distance. So I'm going to bypass that gate here. So when I'm close to the wood fairy, the volume's going to be high.
Hello, traveller. I'm a wood fairy, and these are my magical woods. Bring me
So you can see
flowers, and I
here
might
that
guide
that
you.
automated passive sound mix modifier didn't actually instigate because we're close enough to hear it fine. As we move away,
You are welcome in these woods, but if you want my advice, then I'll need a gift. I do like flowers, especially blue ones.
so the volume fell below that threshold of 0.8, and therefore it was in that range, and therefore the sound mix was called. Given that we've got a min and max volume threshold, we can also set up a passive sound mix modifier to only trigger when the sound is particularly loud. This might seem a little counterintuitive, but if we want a sound to make a real impact when it's loud, then sometimes it can be effective to duck everything else out, since this gives us more headroom for the loud sound. Let's come over to these cave waterfalls here. We've got a little bit of an Indiana Jones scenario where we pick up this wonderful crystal and a problem ensues. In that, the caves start collapsing and we need to escape. Let's have a quick look at what's going on in this blueprint here. So we interact with the blueprint and this starts a timer, and the timer is going to randomly spawn some rocks called actor BP falling rocks. And in here we can see that if the force is above a certain amount, it's going to trigger one of three groups of sounds: some small rocks, some medium rocks, or some large rocks, and that's controlled by the size of the different rocks. Now, since these large rocks can spawn at different distances from the player, what we've done here is set up its sound cue to belong to this rock's big sound class here, and that has a passive sound mix modifier on it. And this time we've got a minimum volume threshold of 0.25. So unless the volume of the rocks gets above that, then this ducking sound mix is not going to be applied. If it does go above that, so it's quite a loud sound already, then what that ducking sound mix is going to do is duck out all of the smaller rocks so that we can really feel the impact of that big rock. So just to illustrate that, I'm going to turn these other ones off. Just clear them for a moment. Go into the cave. And we've still got our stat sound mix active, so that's useful. I'm going to add stat sound cues as well, so we can see the actual volume of those large rocks when they fall. Okay, so there was a large rock and it instigated a sound mix, therefore it must have been above that volume level. That was 33, so again it's above the volume level and it kicked off that sound mix. That was 46, so it did the same. Now that was 0.18 volume, so that large rock was quite a distance away, and so it did not trigger that sound mix. Likewise that one of 0.04. Now a classic use case of this would be the kind of shell shock effect when a big explosion goes off. If the explosion is quite far away, not that loud, then we don't want it to have that effect. But if it's right next to the player, we want it to have a big impact So we might duck out all the other sounds for that loud sound to really feel impressive. Now, one thing we need to note with these passive sound mix modifiers is that we've been talking quite a bit about volume, and it's not the actual volume of the sound itself. So what it does is it looks to the volume multiplier of the sound cue or the sound wave, and it multiplies that by whatever the attenuation settings might be to come up with a figure. So when we were seeing those figures of the volume of those rocks, 0.25 or 0.46 or whatever it was, that was actually not the volume of the sound itself. It was the volume of the sound cue multiplied by the distance away. So it represented the volume of the asset being affected by the attenuation settings. In a later video, we'll look at how we can do this in a slightly more sophisticated way by using a sidechain effect. But for the moment, these passive sound mix modifier techniques are a very efficient way of applying a sound mix automatically every time a sound from a particular class is played. In this video, we've seen